Hello and welcome back. I'm Dan Perry and this is my Masters of Science dissertation, The Hiding Curriculum Toward the Development of LGBTQ+ Curriculum in Higher Education. This is Chapter 1. It's About Time, LGBTQ+ Curriculum Development in Higher Education, the Curriculum and Curricula as Chronobiopolitics. And this presentation is called Community, Activism, LGBT Studies, Queer Theory, Radicalism and the Homophile Movement. That was quite some mouthful. If you haven't already seen my video, Enlightenment to Biological Determinism, I suggest you watch that first before this one. Without further ado, let's get cracking. So in this session, we're going to be looking at the roles of community, activists and academia, theoretical underpinnings of LGBT studies and queer theory, sexual identities in LGBT studies and queer theory, radicalism versus conservatism in some LGBT issues, and the Homophile Movement and its origins. Here we go. Lovers and Others, 2006, Ren 2010, and Valente and Others, 2018, all acknowledge that the role of LGBTQ+ social movements and community activism have been integral to the development of LGBTQ+ curriculum and thought in academia. However, Ren acknowledges that many of the gay rights leaders were not formally educated in further, which is college, or higher education, which is universities, but campus and community would have similar memberships, activities and goals. Additionally, Lovers and Others names these social movements as being second-wave feminists and the gay liberation movements of the mid-20th century. Lovers and Others, Ren, and Valente and Others agree that one could directly and mutually influence the other. As my timeline is only an overview of the major developments of LGBTQ+ curriculum in higher education, I've unfortunately been unable to go into any depth of how social movements and community activists have influenced the developments of LGBTQ+ curriculum. I first want to distinguish a few features of LGBT studies and queer theory for a background of understanding in the areas. Now I'm going to make some generalizations here, but this is generally what I found. LGBT studies are connected with modernist approaches to constructing knowledge, a belief in overarching accounts of events called grand narratives or meta-narratives of history, identity, values, and the origins of development of the sexual self. I believe that modernist approaches to constructing knowledge are the reliance on scientific reasoning or rationalism, empirical research and seemingly neutral objectivity that are deemed to be universal truths. So, as I mentioned, modernist, structuralist, fixed, neutral. They're also stable, binary, and singular as well. Conversely, queer theory is associated with post-structural and postmodern. It critiques meta-narratives or grand narratives, sociological essentialism, reductionism, and emphasizes even self-reflexive understanding. So as I've just said, postmodernist, post-structuralist, fluid, personal, instable or unstable, I should rather say, non-binary and plural. This is what I've found, and these are massive generalizations. But Lovers and Others remind readers that these two branches of thought should not be seen as in competition as to which is right. They will be constantly disputed. This is not to be seen in a negative light, as these disputes create intellectual growth and space. So we now move on to sexual identities in LGBT studies and queer theory. Lovers and Others note that the main arguments between the two branches of LGBT studies and queer theory are their stance on sexual identity politics. LGBT studies emphasize the stability of a single identity, as do all modernist approaches. Queer theory, however, seeks to deconstruct and destabilize identities, as it recognizes there is no single identity of a person. So this means, take me for an example, I can be a son, I can be a brother, I can be a friend, I can be an academic, I can be a whole multiple range of things. That is what that is meaning. You can't reduce down to one identity. So both branches of study, LGBT studies and queer theory, are heavily criticised by each other for their stances. So we now look at some of the criticisms from both perspectives. So LGBT studies are criticised for upholding the boundaries and binaries of identity and examining the world through the perspective of white middle-class cis males. Queer theory, on the other hand, has been criticised for inattention to material conditions, its inability to challenge the heteropatriarchy, and its lack of consideration towards transgender experiences and lives. However, as I've pretty much just said, Lovers and Others reminds readers that these two branches of thought should not be seen in competition as to which is right, because they will be constantly disputed. This is not to be seen in a negative light, as we've already said, as these disputes create intellectual growth and space. I think and agree with Lovers and Others that they echo Apple's conflict theory in education. This is to say that conflict between academic stances and disciplines creates new spaces, new ways of thinking. These tensions become in the timeline when we get there, and is why I've mentioned them here. But for now, I'm moving on to radicalism and conservatism in some LGBT issues. It is believed by Gaziani 2011 that over time, gay and lesbian politics has lost its radical edge that included rights to sex in public spaces, debated the ethics around outings, and used theatrical approaches to protests. Just a side note, outings were political acts that activists would use to expose homophobic public figures who were gay but who were trying to hide their sexuality in public life, so people like religious leaders and politicians. However, Gaziani argues that the gay and lesbian politics have become conservative over time, and focused on family issues and equality in both employment and armed forces in the US. Additionally, Lovers and Others believes that lesbian and gay studies are generally discoursed as beginning in the 1960s and 1970s from the development of the Homophile Movement. I've found inconsistencies in the explanation of what the Homophile Movement is, where and when it originated. Marcius Gonzalez, 2014, believes that the Homophile movements emphasized love and friendship between two same-sex people, homo meaning same, and phile meaning friendship. Rupp 2011 defines the Transnational Homophile Movement as an organisation which was established at the First International Congress for Sexual Equality, 1951 in Amsterdam. However, in the same paragraph, Rupp says the Congress linked to existing homophile groups across national borders. This would suggest that there were homophile movements before the Congress. Further, there seems to be a number of journal articles mentioning USA homophile press and magazines beginning 2 years after the conference, for which, according to Rupp, the USA were not present at. However, Marcius Gonzalez seems to document the most extensively about homophile groups, dating back as far as 1932 in Switzerland. While I accept that the homophile movements in the 1950s were a key development of lesbian and gay studies, I consider that it began much earlier than that. Thank you for joining me. See you again soon in the last theoretical presentation, at least for the moment, history, time and timelines, before we actually move on to the timeline itself. Thank you again and see you soon. Bye.